All right, guys. So for this lecture, we're going to take a little bit of a look at some of the structures of the ear and kind of the basic function of that. I would highly suggest taking a look at the review document, Google Doc, before kind of taking a look at the lecture. Just make sure you're kind of focusing in on some of the basic stuff. So let's go and take a look at this. So the ear houses two of our basic senses, both hearing as well as equilibrium, which is essentially our balance. And the receptors within the ear are what we call mechanoreceptors, so they're actually mechanical in nature. They are very different. So different organs are housed within each portion of the ear. So we'll take a little bit of a look at those. So the ear is actually divided into three areas: the outer, middle, and inner ear. So outer is essentially everything from the tympanic membrane to the auricle or pinna, which is essentially your ear lobe. And then the middle ear is everything from the eardrum to essentially the vestibule or inner ear. So it's this little space right in here. And then, or sorry, middle ear. And then the inner ear are these little structures that kind of looks like a snail, which is kind of referred to as the vestibular cochlea. All right. Middle ear is actually connected to the throat, which is why if you've ever flown on a plane or gone scuba diving or things like that, sometimes you feel like you get pressure in your inner ear, and then if you swallow or yawn or open your mouth, you can actually equalize some of that pressure. But it is connected. All right. Cochlear implants, just kind of give you an idea. So those would be an external device that helps and aids with with hearing, and they actually have a fiber that's actually connected them, or an electrode that essentially connects them directly to the cochlea. So they are on the outside of the skull, but they connect themselves down to here. And this is mostly due to the fact that people usually have some sort of an issue with the bones, or ossicles they call them, or the eardrum itself, so with conducting sound to there. Okay, external ear essentially is involved in hearing only, and there are two basic structures that are part of the external ear: the pinna, or auricle, sometimes it's called, and that's the outer portion that we see, and then the auditory canal, so the opening leading into the ear. The external auditory canal is this kind of narrow chamber that passes through the temporal bone. It is lined with skin, right? And then there is a waxy substance that is produced by the skin that helps to protect it. And then at the end of it, it is the kind of housed the tympanic membrane. The wax is essentially there to keep moisture out, as well as trap dirt or anything that would get into the ear, and then it would kind of work its way out. When we're young, the external auditory canal is actually situated at an angle that goes down, which is why young kids are often subject to outer ear infections. And then as adults, that canal then points the opposite direction. It points downward, kind of giving us the ability to drain that water from our ear. All right. Middle ear, or what's referred to as the tympanic cavity, is kind of an air-filled cavity within the temporal bone, only involved in the sense of hearing. So it's only housing those little bones, the ossicles, and it's involved in conducting that sound directly to the ear. Middle ear, so there's actually two tubes associated with the inner ear. There's what's essentially referred to as the opening from the auditory canal, or the tympanic membrane. And then the auditory canal is connected to the middle ear via the throat. And this is what I was talking about earlier. So you can actually equalize pressure in there by yawning or swallowing. Otherwise, that tube is usually collapsed or kind of closed off. If you've ever had like a throat infection, say like strep throat or any kind of bacterial infection in the throat, and then after you got over that bacterial infection, you ended up with an inner ear infection, it's because that tube is connected. So the bacteria made its way up the tube and into the ear, and then caused some issues there. This just shows some of the tube changes that I was talking about. So this is kids. Kids, that tube is mostly pointed upwards. Okay. So they're showing it right here. So the tube is kind of on an upward trajectory. And then in adults, we can see that that tube then is open more to the outside. So again, it's kind of an upward trajectory here in kids. They can trap a lot of bacteria in there. And in adults, that tube kind of moves its way down. You can see the difference in the auditory tube on the inside connecting the throat and the ear, which is why kids a lot of times on a plane have a hard time equalizing that pressure, because that tube is not very long, and in adults it is. right? Inside of that inner or middle ear, we have those three bones that we always kind of talk about. So the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, better known as the malleus, incus, and stapes, right? When we talk about them in terms of medical, okay? And they're named essentially because that's kind of what they look like. The malleus looks like a hammer, right? It's stationed up against the eardrum. The incus or the anvil is the next one. It kind of looks like a basic anvil you would see in a blacksmith shop. And then the stapes, or what's called the stirrup, looks like a actual stirrup on a saddle of a horse. So that rests up against right there against the oval window on the inside of the ear. And the way that these guys work is they actually vibrate because of the movement of the eardrum. So as sound passes into the ear, it causes this eardrum to vibrate, which in turn causes these bones to vibrate. So they transfer the sound from the tympanic membrane to the inner ear. And people that most often are deaf because of genetic issues, it's because they're missing these bones or missing one of them. Okay. This is what it would look like on the inside of the ear with an ear infection. When you normally look in somebody's ear with an otoscope, you should see this kind of nice, clear, kind of opaque membrane. And if you have a outer ear infection, you're going to have kind of this red area around the outside of the membrane. And if you have an inner ear infection, you're going to actually see that fluid back behind the membrane. So the membrane itself usually will kind of get red around the edges, and then you'll see that fluid. It won't be kind of nice, transparent, and opaque. Right. This is an image of somebody who has actually ruptured their eardrum, either because of a loud noise or something, some sort of pressure right close to them. They were unable to equalize that pressure, and it causes this damage in the eardrum. They probably can still hear, but most of the sound that they get is kind of muffled. So it's very similar to like a speaker. If you have some damage to a speaker cone, the same kind of idea. You'll still hear sound. It just won't be as the same quality sometimes. You can also see this person has probably ruptured that eardrum a couple times because you can actually see the scarring along the outside of the eardrum here as well. Versus if we go back to this other picture, this is nice and clear, no scarring. You can actually see the bones back behind here. And in this one, you can't see those. But in that picture, you can definitely see the scarring here. You can still see the bone here in the middle, but you're actually seeing into the inner ear. And now this person's probably going to be susceptible to infections, both outer as well as inner. You can see they've got some sort of infection going on here with this redness. Inner ear then is what we refer to sometimes as the bony labyrinth. They've got these little semicircular canals at the top. They've got the cochlea at the bottom, and then the oval window in the center. It's actually filled with a fluid called perilymph. It's kind of the consistency of, say, like soap. So it's kind of a little bit thicker, but not kind of watered down, and it's not a gel. It's kind of a mixture between the two. So inside of the bony labyrinth, we've got a couple different structures that are housed within the temporal bone. So you have the cochlea, which are these little, which is little snail-looking guy here at the bottom. You have the vestibule. The vestibule is where the oval window. So this is exactly where the bones rest up, the ossicles rest up against, and then the semicircular canals up here at the top. Each one of them plays a little different role in hearing. So you have an organ called the organ of Corti, which is actually housed within the cochlea. Sorry, it actually has little receptors inside of it that are essentially little hair cells. Those little hair cells are floating within a gel. And then the hair cells will bend depending on the sound that we get. So the cochlea then changes those sound waves by the little movement of the hairs into a nerve impulse that essentially goes to the temporal lobe of the brain, and then we finally hear something. Okay, so you can see here's the little structure. So inside of that little snail-looking structure on the inner ear are these little chambers. So the air passes through these little chambers, or the pressure waves pass through these little chambers, and then these are the little hairs that are housed in there. So the hairs are moved by this little structure up here at the top, right? And then depending on how those are bent, or how much of those are bent, and how far into the cochlea they're bent, they are transmitted to the brain, and then we get our different pitches of sound. All right, so the vibration of the sound moves those tectoral membranes, and then the hairs essentially get bent, and then that creates an action potential in the nerve, and then we can continue to move that. This one right here has more to do with prolonged periods of noise. So when people expose themselves to noise for long periods of time, they can actually get it, they can adapt. It's the same as like eating sour candy. Over time, it's not as sour as much. Well, same thing here. If you have earbuds in or headphones on, or you're listening to loud music, over time you adapt to that loud music, and it takes more and more of that to stimulate that nerve impulse. Right. This just shows some of the actual functions here. So outer, middle, and ear, we can see the amplitude in those. And the whole idea here is we're trying to increase that amplitude as we get in there. But the louder the sound, again, the louder that amplitude will be once we get into the inner ear. I'll post these 3 videos that kind of talks a little bit about kind of how that works. Right, so you'll get a chance to see those. We're going to move on a little bit and talk about the organ of equilibrium, which is the vestibule, as well as the semicircular canals. So each one of those canals houses the same kind of idea. They have these little hairs floating in fluid in there, and the same thing in the vestibule. Okay, and we have actually 2 different types of equilibrium. So we have what's called static or static equilibrium. So this is head positioning. So where is your head in space? And dynamic equilibrium is how your head moves. So static equilibrium simply just tells your brain your head is stationary, or your head is upside down, or you've turned your head to the side. And dynamic equilibrium is kind of more movement of the head. All right. So static equilibrium, there's these little receptors. You don't have to remember them specifically for the test, but they simply just report position of the head. Those little guys are inside of that. They're inside of the vestibule. All right. And they have these little things called otoliths. So these little tiny stones that are actually floating in the gel inside of that. I'll show you a picture here in a second. But when you move your head, those little otoliths move in that gel based on your movement, and they bend the little hairs. And then that essentially tells your brain which direction you moved your head. So if you have your head upright, you tip your head forward, the little stones kind of slide down, they move the hairs in that direction, and it tells your brain that you tilted your head. If people have an issue with these, they can then cause problems with their ability to know that. So people with vertigo a lot of times have an issue either with these little otoliths or with the way that the hairs are bent. So it could happen because of a concussion, severe blow to the head, or an inner ear infection sometimes can cause those things. This just shows a little bit more of kind of how that happens. So when the lymph flows over the top, it takes that little kind of cap with it, the cupula, and kind of bends it, and then the hairs bend with it. Okay, just talking a little bit more about that. So an impulse is sent, so that essentially just kind of gives us that idea. This explains that much better than what I just did. So I'll kind of go through and I'll post that so you guys can see that basic. And then this talks a little bit of a recap of those basic processes. Okay. One of the things that happens though as we age is these little hairs become stiffer, which is why older people a lot of times have an issue with their equilibrium. All right, so they're unable to kind of keep their basic equilibrium, and usually it's dynamic equilibrium. So dynamic equilibrium is driven by these little semicircular canals, whereas static equilibrium is driven by the vestibule, which is why older people a lot of times can't get on those crazy spinny rides when they used to enjoy them when they were younger. Those little hairs have gotten stiff, and they're unable to kind of sense that change in direction, so their brain doesn't associate that movement with any kind of basic equilibrium in the brain. Okay. All right, we're gonna go ahead and stop there. We'll try to pick back things up to get rid of this or finish the test up by Friday here, and try to finish up special senses.